of the Midsummer Festival. My name is Judith Ellis and I'm the library's president and hosting tonight's discussion event. And welcome to our very special guests, Noah Riseman and Sam Elkin, who I will introduce in more detail shortly. And I'd also like to acknowledge fellow board member here, Paul, who is one of our newest board members. Just throw your hand up there, Paul, so everyone can see you. Thank you. Our library is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded, it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. A couple of things about the facilities. Being in the bathroom, you just go back out the door of this room, do a sharp U-turn and they'll be on your left. And in event of emergency, we have two emergency exits. One again is back through that door and downstairs. The other is through this door and to the end of the passageway. Of course, if something does happen, our staff will be absolutely sure to make sure that you're exiting the building safely and securely and get you out of the building. We were established in 1854, with our 170th anniversary last year, and we're the second oldest public library in Victoria. We've got a collection of over 40,000 items and take pride in being the sole library in Australia with such an extensive collection available for loan. And our focus is very much rooted in local history, and we've got a wealth of information covering most towns across Victoria. So our library staff tonight, Jade and Ellen, will be taking photographs and videos that we've put on our YouTube channel so that people can watch it again or tell friends to watch it. And we'll be doing that today. If anyone has any difficulties being photographed, please let us know and we can accommodate that easily. So I'd like to welcome Noah Riseman and Sam Elkin, so Noah and Sam, who are joining us for tonight's panel discussion entitled Transgender Australia, A History Since 1910, which is Noah's fifth, I think, and most recent book. Yes, yeah. Noah is a long-standing social researcher who conducts projects which benefit diverse communities. He's an adjunct professor at La Trobe University, where he specialises in Australian histories of sexuality, gender and race. Sam is a non-binary transmasculine writer, an event producer, co-editor and a radio maker, I found out by Googling you, and I want to know what that is afterwards. Sam's published his own memoir called Detachable Penis, A Queer Legal Saga. You can do a plug for that in a minute and tell us about the nomination. And also co-edited another book called Nothing to Hide, Voices of Trans and Gender Diverse People, Nothing to Hide, Voices of Trans and Gender Diverse Australia, published just last year. He's written a number of essays and hosts the 3RRR radio show called Queer View Mirror. So thank you both for coming along. We're looking forward to the discussion, which is just people raising questions, queries, comments, and while you're thinking of what to ask, I'll go and sit over there next to the guys and I'll start with one question. It's over to you. So, this is a question actually that covers both of your areas of research. So, Noah, your research spans over 100 years of trans history in Australia. And so you're actively involved in contemporary trans storytelling. So how do you each see the historical patterns of trans activism in Victoria connected to today's movements and challenges? So comparing that.
I have the microphone. Oh, that's loud. So I think I'm talking first. Thanks so much. I'd also just quickly add the acknowledgement that we're on Kulin country, so acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people, and also the long traditions of gender and sexually diverse people in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, including sister girls, brother boys, and all other gender diverse mob. And I also have to put out this disclaimer that just what I'm speaking about tonight is in my personal capacity, and based on research that I've done, but I'm not speaking on behalf of any of my employer. I do need to put that out there. So yes, returning to the question, I mean, I'm slightly biased as a historian. I think history explains everything. But I think when looking at the, sorry, I'm already forgetting the question. So it was about activism in Victoria
in Victoria, so how do you see the historical patterns of trans activism historically and in terms of the contemporary environment? Because you're looking at both those in your research.
So if we're thinking activism, I think trans activism, trans-specific activism in Victoria sort of emerged in the really late 70s, early 80s, when there was this really small group called, and I'm just being history, some of the terms I'm using are considered outdated. I'm just giving that heads up for everyone. But there was a really small group called the Victorian Transsexual Coalition. And what they were really pushing for was to be recognized legally in their affirmed genders. But I mean, it was very of its time in that it was a very small group. They weren't very visible, and I think that's a huge difference from the activism that came out of the 90s and today, is that visibility is a very important part of that adage that you can't be what you can't see. This organization was operating much more secretly in that, and part of that was a safety thing, in that these were women, it was trans women at the time. They had gender affirmation surgery. They were living sort of quiet lives in suburbia in Melbourne. And, you know, it was dangerous if they were discovered to be trans. They could be attacked. I mean, it still happens, but it was even more dangerous then. And also they didn't have any anti-discrimination laws to protect them. So if they were discovered to be trans, their employers could sack them and that would be totally fine. So I think on the one hand, the activism they were doing was mostly letter writing. They were writing letters to Parliament, writing letters to politicians. They weren't really having a media presence. And in fact, they used the few times that they did have something in the media, they actually used a fake name. So they didn't even go on the record with their real name. And what they were advocating for was for trans people who had had gender affirmation surgery to be allowed to change their birth certificate gender, and also for anti-discrimination reforms. And they very much played a politics of respectability. So very much they were trying to position themselves as white, middle-class women. And I don't say this in a judgmental way, but that was the sort of way that they were representing activism. And I guess the flip side of that is that was also excluding others. It was excluding people who didn't fit that mold of what it meant to be trans, that didn't fit that mold of what it meant to be a woman, and very much was excluding women of color. It was excluding sex workers, especially. And there was even one letter I found where there was an inquiry in the Victorian government into prostitution that reached out to them and said, do you want to put in a submission? And they were like, well, no, this isn't a trans issue. Sure, there might be some trans sex workers, but that's not really us. So I think the activism has changed, and it wasn't overnight, but over 40 years, I like to think that the activists have become much more conscious of trans as more of an umbrella, of trans communities being much more diverse. And I think Sam writes about this really well in his book about a lot of the needs of the community are very different from what some of the white middle class needs were. And again, that's not to say that those needs aren't important as well, but there's a lot more out there. I might stop rambling now and let Sam talk.
Not rambling at all, Noah. It's very interesting to think about how trans activism has changed. My head is very much in the sort of post-Donald Trump era, and I feel like we've kind of moved again into a different political period. My book, Detachable Penis, is sort of set around here, actually, over at Queer Legal Service from 2018 to 2021, and so I was sort of looking at LGBTIQA plus politics in a period where Dan Andrews and the Labor government was being very supportive of the rainbow community. You know, there was money going into the Pride Centre, there was money for things like LGBTIQA plus leadership programs and all sorts of things, and the Queer Legal Service, which is the service that I was working in at the time. And for multiple reasons, you know, whether it's the issues around Victoria's debt and a sort of increasing backlash against LGBTIQA plus people and trans and gender diverse people in particular. I feel like we've moved into a different era now, and I'm not sure how the politics is going to play out. I'm really fascinated by Transgender Victoria as an organisation, as a bit of a kind of bellwether of what's going on. You know, when I was really active a few years ago with the Queer Legal Service, I feel like Transgender Victoria was going through heaps of growing pains around issues of racial justice. So, you know, it was set up by, white middle-class trans women, and then sort of increasingly there were lots of other people knocking on the door being like, hey, why aren't you representing us? You know, why aren't you representing intersectional disabilities, people from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, people like international students who have very different political priorities to people that have citizenship. So, you know, there were heaps of debates which I think were really, you know, difficult at the time, but in the long term really constructive and important to make that a more kind of progressive and inclusive organisation. Now, in the last 2 years, because I think Transgender Victoria has been like weirdly well funded, which I don't think is going to happen ever again, you know, we've been able to do things like makeup workshops and, you know, like chest surgery discussions before and after, you know, that sort of more like peer support, inclusive stuff that I suppose is attempting to sort of address people's mental health and emotional needs and social needs, which is really important. But yeah, I feel like we're going through this period of backlash now where politics is going to get, you know, a lot more ugly. I mean, it's kind of been a bit ugly, and I think it's going to get uglier. And I'm not sure what the right response will be. You know, I was just interviewing a low cruiser US-based comedian and poet, and they're talking about how, you know, comedy is the thing they want to lean into. They want to lean into absurdity and like not playing respectability politics and be as out there as possible. And maybe that's the politics of this era. Like, I don't know yet, but I'm very interested to find out.
Just mention something here. So I don't know how many of you saw it. There was an article in this morning's Age, actually. I don't know if you caught that, by Eloise Brooke, and she it's about the federal review being a turning point for trans healthcare, handing it to the National Health and Medical Research Council. And she was saying this is really good because it takes the politicisation out of the issue, because she said it's become political and political football. And as we've seen what's going on in the States, it's just unbelievable. Britain, Queensland, it's filtering around. Sorry, I digress. Another question, comment?
This is sorry, but I'm having trouble hearing with that microphone.
Oh yes, we'll share with this one. Yes.
I'm also very loud anyway.
There's no green light going on this one.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
Just on the point about the review of gender affirming healthcare, massive change. So for anyone who doesn't know, Queensland has said that they're pausing gender affirming healthcare for young people, similar to the ban on trans healthcare for young people in the United States under the age of 19. The federal government has come out and said, we'll have a review to try and take the political heat out of the issue. And trans organisations like Equality Australia and Transcend and so on have sort of cautiously welcomed the review, whereas others like Pride in Protest, which I think is a Sydney-based organisation, have been much more strident in their opposition to this decision. I can understand the political decision of the government to try and sort of outmaneuver Queensland and what they're doing, but I think that if history shows us anything, reviews can lead to more reviews, which can lead to more reviews. I think we had 4 inquiries into the religious discrimination bill stuff at the federal level. So I think the decision to kind of kick it into a review is actually a massive defeat for us. I think it concedes really important ground that the science is already established and that we don't need another review. So I personally think it's really unfortunate what's happened, but again, it's a sign that, you know, we live in these times. It's hard to know how to respond, you know, and the interesting thing about history is that you get to, you know, assess in the, you know, with a cup of tea and a biscuit, like whether somebody made a good decision or not. But, you know, when these are things that are happening in the heat of the moment and your communities are being affected at the time, it's hard to know what the right decision is. And I know, you know, everybody's going into it with the best of intentions, but
yeah, I do worry about the viability of youth-related trans healthcare. I think it's probably going to go the way of what's happened in the UK with the suspension of puberty blockers until 2027, which is really sad and difficult.
I'm just going to briefly say for various reasons, I'm not going to really comment on the review, except to say that my hunch, and I don't know if it'll play out this way, but why some of those organizations might be welcoming it is maybe they're hoping that it'll be the sort of anti-cast review, if that makes sense. So the cast review, for those who don't know, was it was a stitch up, to be frank, but it was in the UK. It was basically a similar type of review run in the UK, but it was stacked with people who were anti-trans. So surprise, surprise, it said, oh, we don't support trans healthcare. But that review is now being cited all over the world. And so maybe there's a hope, and again, I mean, but maybe there's a hope that if this one comes out and says the opposite, then there'll be another review that can be. But anyway, the other thing is, regardless, it's not going to please anyone. I would say that if the review supports trans healthcare, that anti-trans people are still going to be against it. And if it's against it, we'll know it was a stitch up. So no one's going to be pleased by it. But that leads to this other point that I would just say, which is, it's not about healthcare and it's not about sport. It's never been about those things. It's just transphobia. And if you look at the history of this stuff, the way that Ricky Coughlin, who's a former trans athlete who I interviewed, and she tweeted once, and I thought it was great. She used the expression that children and sport are the low-hanging fruit. Transphobes are going after, or they're using those, they're weaponizing sport and they're weaponizing children's healthcare because they're things that can play on people's emotions, on people's misperceptions, on quote-unquote common sense. And that's how they're getting in. But they don't care about children, trans children. They don't care about the healthcare of children. They don't care about sport. Those are the ins they're using. It's just blatant transphobia. And I think the history shows that. And there's a whole history of trans children's healthcare that I've written about. It's been happening, affirming care in Australia, since 2003. I'm pretty sure, Sam, you can correct me if I got this wrong, but one of the lead anti-trans people in Australia actually went on Twitter a year and a bit ago, calling out to see if there was anyone who had affirming care as a child in Australia that had detransitioned because they wanted to do a lawsuit. They couldn't find anyone. And you'll notice when they wheel out detransitioners who had affirming care as children, they're always from the US and the UK. And they can't, it's going well in Australia. Sorry, that's all I was gonna say on that front.
Thank you. Again, in this article, they were saying basically the science has been done. It's been here for a while, and they're hopefully going to engage people who are from universities and medical institutions and institutes and people with lived experience to participate in this process. So fingers crossed. Comments, questions? Okay, I'll find another one. Actually, I'll divert. Tell us about what's happening with your book.
Yes, I was lucky enough to be shortlisted for the Victorian Premier's Literary Prize. There's a new, thank you. There's a new category of humour writing to honour John Clarke. It's just come in for the first time this year, and it's going to be once every 2 years. So, yeah, it's really exciting, and I love humorous books. So now I've got sort of 5 other books to read. So, yeah, very, very excited. Thank you.
And I should mention too, we've got books around this theme on the table at the back there. That's just some. That's just some of our trans collection, all available to be borrowed. And if we want to purchase any or all of your books, how do we do that?
Well, I mean, Hares and Hyenas, is Victoria's most wonderful LGBTIQA plus bookshop, and I understand they're doing it pretty tough at the moment, tough economic climate. So, yeah, just get down to the Pride Centre or jump online and order our books from Hares and Hyenas.
Terrific. Okay. Sam, your work on Nothing to Hide and your radio show, you've platformed many trans voices. How do you think the way trans people tell their own stories has actually evolved? Question for both of you. Since the early documented case in the way that your research has shown, since 1910 onwards. How do you think that's changed, evolved, telling those stories, using their voices?
Well, I actually had cause to look at your book just yesterday. It's an incredible resource, and I feel like, like I've been doing a big cull for my books at the moment, and I've just been like, I don't need this. If I can get it at the library, I don't need it anymore. This is my edit. I'm trying to become a minimalist. But Noah's book, I'm not getting rid of. I look at it all the time. It's an incredibly useful reference. And I was doing a book review for the Australian Book Review about Bonjour, Mademoiselle, which is a new biography by Jacqueline Kent and Tom Roberts about April Ashley, who was a trans woman big in the 1960s in the UK who had gender-affirming surgery in Casablanca, was a model, married a member of the minor nobility, and ended up having one of the most famous trans law cases, Corbett, which unfortunately set back law reform for trans people for about 35 years, all of which I read in Noah's book in very succinct and concise way. So I've just read that biography, and I'd really recommend it. Bonjour, Mademoiselle. It was a really good book. But one of the things that I found really interesting in the author's note, they talk about how April referred to her own gender history using the male birth name and male pronouns, and really talks about two periods of a life. So, the sort of pre-transition male era and the post-transition female era, and the site of change is very much focused on the gender-affirming surgery that happened when she was 25. And, that's a tricky issue for an author, contemporary author today, to navigate, because it's very much not a convention in trans and gender diverse storytelling now to talk about the prior you being in a different sex or gender and with a different name. You sort of, earlier trans history is a really interesting one. I'm sure, Noah, you had huge amounts of thorny questions around how to detail people's lives, and the authors in that book, Bonjour, Mademoiselle, decided to go with the way April spoke about her life, which does talk about a male prior period. And as the reviewer, I was like, I can't argue with that. It's an interesting authorial decision, but I do feel like that's a massive way that storytelling has changed. The before and after story is not really so much of a thing anymore. We talk about transitions between different stages of lives, continual evolution, and more of a kind of, coherent identity, I suppose, across a lifetime. And it's interesting to think about how storytelling will change again, because, you live in your own political moment and you think this is the truth of the situation. But I'm sure people will talk differently about trans experience in 10 and 20 years. And, they'll look at my book and think, wow, what old-fashioned and outdated and offensive terminology that person has used.
This isn't intended to turn into a love-in of both of our books, but can I just say, I've told Sam this before, because I read a lot, especially on trains, planes, automobiles. Sam's book was the best book I read in 2024. It really was. So, read it. And if you can't buy it, I mean, there's a library copy back there. But I agree with everything that Sam said, and I guess just the one thing I'd add is it's less them telling their stories, but so I usually prefer to work with living people, living participants. So usually when I'm writing, if it's from people's own stories they've shared with me, it'll reflect how they talk about themselves. So like the approach that author took. But the challenge is when you're looking at people who aren't living, and also if you're going further back in time, people who the word trans didn't exist, let alone do we know how they identified. And I touch on this mostly in the first chapter of the book, that sort of period before the Second World War, where you had people who were living as another gender from their sex assigned at birth, but we don't know why. So maybe it was because they identified with that gender, But especially if they were assigned female at birth and living as men, it might have been for social reasons, because in that time, if you were a man, you'd have more, well, even still you have more privileges, but even more so back then, in terms of economic opportunities and in society and laws. So we don't know if these people are what we would now call trans or not, but even if they did identify as a gender different from their sex assigned at birth, maybe they wouldn't use the word trans the way we use it now. So with historical, and also there is that challenge of dead naming or not dead naming, because again, we don't know how they identified. There's a famous case from the late 1800s that I don't talk about in that book, but Edward de Lacy Evans, who was someone from Bendigo, who it was discovered was actually assigned female at birth, and then, was institutionalized and then released, but then lived the rest of their life as a woman with their woman's name, but we don't know if they necessarily would have wanted to do that. So are we allowed to use the woman name with them? And it gets messy. And I guess for me, the most important thing is to at least try and talk through these issues and explain why we're taking the approaches that we're taking, like it sounds like that author did. And, the most important thing is to try to affirm the voices of the people, but when that voice is hidden because they weren't able to speak for themselves, it's, I guess, also talking about those possibilities without necessarily being definitive, because we can't be definitive in the absence of them saying so.
Can I just pick up on that? When you're saying that the people themselves are hidden and their stories are hidden and everything around them is hidden, how do you manage to do research and to find these people's stories? How do you do that?
So that's why I usually prefer to stick to the post-World War II era, where I can find actual people and talk to them. But for the earlier periods, what other historians and what I did is, what is interesting, in other historians like Lucy Chesser, and her book is on the back table as well, have written about, is newspapers were so fascinated with people who, to use the old-fashioned expression, cross-dressed. So there were stories galore in the newspapers, and they would usually, in that period before the 1930s, use the expression man-woman or woman-man, and there'd be these headlines like, oh, man-woman, and then there'd be the marvelous case of Edward de Lacy Evans. So these cases were regularly in the media. So Trove, who is every historian's best friend, like, you can find these cases in Trove. Sometimes there are court records that you can then go back to, and there'll be the sort of court case, because they were often arrested for, it's been a while since for vagrancy. Vagrancy was the big crime in the late 1800s. Vagrancy was a catch-all crime, basically, for being poor. It was basically criminalizing poverty, but it covered things like sex work and being homeless, and it also covered cross-dressing. So, sometimes there's court records for the vagrants, and, but that's sort of the starting point. There are other historians who are far more talented than me, who go back even further in time and can find historical records of these figures who it's sort of ambiguous about their gender, and, or they can find records. I'm more trained as a more contemporary historian, which is why I'm amazed by the people who go back to, like, medieval times or ancient Greece. Actually, I remember hearing a talk once from a trans historian based in the UK who did stuff on the ancient world, and she gave examples from, like, ancient records about these groups where, like, these people basically changed their genders and gave these examples, and it was mind-boggling. But those aren't the sorts of records I'm used to using, so I couldn't tell you.
I'll follow that up with another question. You mentioned courts just then. So both of you engage with legal and institutional histories that affect trans Victorians. So what historical barriers have proven most persistent? So barriers that remain and have proven persistent, and on the other side, what have been the most meaningful areas of progress? And this is, courts, legal, institutional environments.
First, only because I reflected on this after I read Sam's book. Because in the book, I talked about the sort of the two big things, I suppose you could say, that activists were pushing for, and were very much being recognized in your affirmed gender, so able to, which through various things always came back to your birth certificate. Almost always came back to your birth certificate. and the other one being anti-discrimination reforms. So those pushes, like that group I mentioned before that started in the 1980s, and then by the 90s, what becomes Transgender Victoria takes it up. And then we know even more recently, there was the push to change birth certificates so that they could have non-binary gender markers and not require surgery. So those were the big legal changes that were being pushed by activists. But why I was reflecting after reading Sam's book is they really are very middle-class issues. And that's not to say that they're not important for people from other backgrounds. But yeah, I'm going to hand to Sam now because I think Sam might have more to say, maybe not. But just that seemed to me, they were important issues and they were the big activist issues, but they were more so middle class, I think, than some of the other things affecting trans people's lives.
Yeah, well, I guess like sort of big picture, the big issues is sort of identification, and that is important for travel, for access to a job or social security benefits without necessarily experiencing discrimination for having to, you know, out yourself as trans. So that's why that sort of issue is so important. And then you've got the issue of access to healthcare, which is a very kind of big issue, and that can be both a legal issue and a, you know, actual on the ground access to issues like it, you know, if you're living in Horsham or whatever, the one gender affirming healthcare service that's in Abbotsford is pretty far away. So it can be, you know, a social issue. And yet we're seeing in this political moment the restriction of access to healthcare being a live political issue and, you know, really concerning kind of area where we're having to defend the wins that we've had, you know. What I really wanted to see, you know, and still really wanted to see was gender affirming healthcare, particularly surgeries, to be available under Medicare. That was a social demand that I hoped we were heading towards. And now it feels like we're definitely not heading there. And in fact, you know, we're going to struggle to retain what we've already got. So, yeah, healthcare, of course, remains a battleground. I think a less discussed issue, but is very much playing out in the United States at the moment, is prisons. So, you know, where do you get housed if you're incarcerated? And to, you know, a similar extent, immigration detention, mental health units, anywhere where you're detained against your will, and where there's gender segregation that takes place, the issue of trans people will always come up. So, yeah, not to harp on about the Trump apocalypse that's going on at the moment, but, you know, he's just banned trans women from being in women's prisons in the United States and has completely banned any gender-affirming healthcare to using federal funding, which means a ban, because where else are they going to go other than the services that are there? So, you know, that's a huge issue, and that remains a kind of thorny political issue that kind of doesn't get talked about heaps in Victoria, but is a real issue, the issue of like changing your name if you're incarcerated. So some people, you know, can be incarcerated for sort of 20 years and the state has the right to just reject your name change. And if you're, you know, if you're going in for a long time, then that is a pretty big deal. So there's, you know, big legal issues that are important to people that are more marginalised and on the periphery of our society. The issue of sort of immigration and access to like asylum seeker claims here in Australia was something that I was really sort of fascinated and disturbed by during my time as a lawyer for the LGBTIQ legal service. You know, they pretty much just kind of like put a ban on anyone from Malaysia getting access to refugee status on the grounds of LGBTIQ status while I was working there. And it was just sort of like very difficult to deal with that. And, you know, everything is so shadowy when you're dealing with the Office of Home Affairs that it can become, you know, just a basic sort of information sharing can become incredibly difficult. So it really depends on who you are and what your background is. I think, you know, for a lot of us in the trans community, like Australian citizenship has just kind of been taken for granted as a bit of a just a non-issue. But, for people, there are so many people that have sought asylum here in Australia and have been subjected to, really inappropriate and invasive questions that are culturally inappropriate, based on kind of Western understandings of what it means to be, queer or trans or whatever. So, there are so many legal issues, and it really depends on who you are and what your needs are at that particular time.
You both mentioned the legal and institutional barriers, and obviously there are a lot, and who knows what happens next. Can you think, I think you might have mentioned a few earlier, Noah, of where the most meaningful progress might have been in that institutional and legal environment? Just on a positive note.
Look, on a positive note, I meant to be apolitical, but you're asking me a political question. Look, I think Sam's hinted at this. I think Dan Andrews in Victoria, has done a lot for the whole did a lot. He's not Premier anymore, for the LGBTIQ plus community. He pushed through what I refer to as the second round of birth certificate reform. But what I think actually more importantly, when there were right-wing attacks from the media and politicians, rather than cowering, he actually stood up to them. And that, for me, was bigger probably than any other necessary legal issue. And also, I think could be a lesson for other politicians, because last I checked, he kept winning majorities. And so it turns out sometimes standing up for this stuff can be popular, but I'm meant to be apolitical, so I might end there.
Yeah, there's been, 30, 40, whatever amount of years worth of law reform that people have done, so certainly not to denigrate any of that. Self-identification, birth certificate laws has been a huge win, that's still a political campaign that people are working on to make that even across the whole country, because, of course, even if you live in Melbourne, if you were born in Western Australia or the NT or whatever it is, it's those laws that count. There's been amazing progress. If I seem downcast at the moment, it's just that it's all too clear at the moment how easy it is for these delicate rights to be won and then lost again. So for me, I think what we've really seen in the last sort of 20 odd years is what we can do when we're united, and when we come together as the LGBTIQA plus community around common causes and try and bring more people in as opposed to sort of excluding. I'm really always deeply saddened when I see sort of unnecessary division and infighting and things like that. I really think that we're really going to have to work on being united and learn how to work with people that we don't necessarily like or find to have the most excellent politics all of the time, because we are entering a period now where I think things are going to get more difficult to even retain what social rights we have, and we're going to have to work together. And I think that looking at history and political activists, across the spectrum, this is why history really matters, because you see people, making important alliances and doing stuff behind the scenes that, make a real difference to our real rights on the ground.
It's a bit self-interested, but have you seen a shift in how collecting institutions have been making trans resources available and accessible, particularly through catalogues?
So I was saying earlier I love librarians, and I still do. The little I can speak to is I do know that there is a librarian at the National Library of Australia, a trans librarian. I actually interviewed her, and I don't remember how you find it now on Trove, but she has compiled these massive lists of trans books, not just Australia focused, but globally. And I had never seen a list so long in my life. So I think librarians in general, I think, tend to be progressive and wonderful people. And I think where they have the resources, they certainly are doing the best they can, like you are. But I guess it also does come down to the individual librarians who are able to take the initiative. But luckily, there's a lot of you who are taking initiative. think that's my answer.
This might be a really obvious and self-explanatory silly question, but I was just interested in what the significance of the 1910 was.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I get asked that all the time and I always forget to say. No, first off, I'm glad you asked it. Because in no way, shape, or form am I at all trying to deny gender diversity on this continent or anywhere else before 1910. We know gender diversity has existed since time immemorial. The reason for 1910 is that's the year that Magnus Hirschfeld, who's a German sexologist, publishes a book. And again, forgive me, it's now an outdated term, but he publishes a book called Transvestites. And in that, he coins that term, and that's the beginning of the language of trans. So the way I put it is not denying trans before that, but every book needs a starting point. So I chose 1910 because that's when the language of trans begins.
Gentlemen?
So just to follow up what you just said, because that's exactly the question I was going to ask, actually. What happened, you said, was it Magnus Hirschfeld? Is that correct? He came up with this term. What was the response back then?
That's a good question. So it didn't really make much news. It's before mass media, but the first mention of that term in an Australian newspaper was in 1912, if memory serves. And it was in the context of this article about a German baron who had been assigned male at birth and was now living as a woman. And it was like this tiny little story, and it's like, oh, there's this guy, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld refers to this as transvestitism. And so it doesn't really pick up, but there's lots of scholarship on Hirschfeld, and I have to admit, I'm not an expert because I'm not a German historian, but Hirschfeld was well, first of all, can I just say the book, I've read it, if you can get past the word is now outdated, it is really ahead of its time. Because what he does in that book is he talks about all sorts of different reasons that people might dress or live in a gender different from their sex assigned at birth. He doesn't say it's this one thing. He actually talks about all sorts of different reasons for diverse gender expressions that are very relevant even today. So Hirschfeld, way ahead of his time. He had an institute in, I think it was Berlin. It was Berlin. Okay, you might know more than me about Hirschfeld. He had an institute in Berlin, and he was sort of recognized at his time as at the forefront of sexology. He also did research on homosexuality. The Nazis, that was the first thing they went for. They destroyed his institute, and that's a lesson, by the way. It's always the trans people they go for first. So a lot of his work was lost by virtue of that. But in terms of in Australia and in outside of Germany, it sort of got that mention in 1912. Sort of German sexology sort of reaches sort of the UK and the English-speaking world more so in sort of the 1920s, and it kind of gradually infiltrates Australian psychiatry in the 1930s. But it's not really viewed down upon or anything. It's just sort of, it's this very niche area of psychiatry, which itself at the time is a niche discipline. And it's more so after the Second World War that those ideas start becoming more popularized, I suppose. Does that answer your question, I hope? Do you know more about Hirschfeld than me? No? Okay. Sorry. There's a lot on Hirschfeld. Oh, maybe some of the audience does.
Well, just to say that if the picture that you see of the Nazis burning books is burning Max Hirschfeld's Institute of Sexology's collection, which was a massive library collection. It's not just Hirschfeld's books. And the literature that had been collected together to that time went up.
And it's the first.
Yeah.
That's the first.
The first.
Burning. Right. So it's does all those things, as a historian to look at and go, well, that's the point. And went for that.
Did you have a question as well?
I'm not sure if I've got a question. I'm trying to process the thought, but it sort of comes out of that as well. You're talking about unity and strength to fight these things. I'm going to go back to another point. During the marriage equality debate, I had a very strong sense that the trans community was thrown under the bus by the gay and lesbian communities. And there is a certain level of privilege in either for both of those in comparison. Is unity possible? Or is it, I don't know, I just want to open the thought. It's on my mind a lot at the moment, given the circumstances.
It's on my mind a lot as well. It's a really difficult question, and I think that it's a case-by-case scenario. Like, what unity can look like is, agreeing to disagree, or working together on some things and not on others. I think the way that the marriage equality campaign was run in Australia was, imported very consciously from Ireland and how they succeeded. And, I remember there was a fellow from Ireland who was basically being like, this is the playbook, get good looking, largely white, youthful, able-bodied, gay and lesbian people, on posters, and don't talk about trans stuff. That was very much a conscious political consideration, and it was this idea that once we get marriage equality, then we'll work on a whole bunch of other things. And to be honest, that kind of did happen for at least a couple of years. We've seen birth certificate law reform, while incomplete. Some states and territories have much more progressive laws than they did. Conversion therapy was prohibited, which is a huge issue. So it is true that the kind of broad LGBTIQA plus professional kind of lobbying groups have kind of worked on other issues. It's not like they went, we've got same-sex marriage now and we're not interested anymore. And it's also true that for trans people, the issue of same-sex marriage is really important because at least until, recently you had sort of forced trans divorce in order to, access gender-affirming healthcare and to access birth certificate changes. So it was all kind of an interlinked issue, but it certainly did leave a bad taste in one's mouth, the whole thing. And, I feel like I don't have enough distance. I don't feel like I know how this story ends. Because if we lose everything, then was it worth it in the first place? Probably not, because it certainly upset a lot of people and it did a lot of damage. But if this is a minor blip, what's going on with the pause on gender-affirming healthcare, and that this isn't the beginning of a massive backlash, then, perhaps the strategy that they utilised had some merit. Only time will tell. But in terms of the possibilities of unity, I think I've reflected on this heaps. The concept of LGBTIQA plus, as we politically define it at the moment, I think, won't remain that way forever. It certainly hasn't existed for that long. It's a current political characterisation, and it's been really useful for a lot of organisations just for funding purposes and to kind of advocate for, organisations like Thorn Harbour Health and Drummond Street. They've kind of changed the way that they've wanted to be perceived to government in order to obtain more funding. But you have to look at the leadership structures that are in place, and it's not just those organisations, but every organisation. Who's making the real decisions? Are they reflective of the entire rainbow community and intersections and racial and ethnic minorities, or do they still focus on one particular identity and experience? So I think that's what we need to critically reflect on, and we don't just want kind of unity for unity's sake. We can only get to unity and coalition when there's, truth and power for each community.
I'll just briefly say first, everything Sam's describing now, he describes really well in his book. He actually does. But also, I guess I'd just say two, maybe three quick things. One, I think building on what Sam just said, I've also been reflecting and have a lot why are LGBT and T together? And I'm not saying that as a turf type, but we're not the same. And what brought us together was that basically right-wing bigots hate us all. That's basically what brought us together. But I think that unity is important, and it is, and I think that maybe I'm slightly more optimistic on this. I do think that gay and lesbian people learned from the mistakes of throwing trans people under the bus under marriage equality. I do think when you look at a lot of those organizations, some are better than other at all the issues that Sam's just raised, but big picture, they're not abandoning their trans siblings, I think to an extent did happen during marriage equality. And the other thing I was going to say is the unity thing is interesting because one thing that if you look at the trans community is not always necessarily been united as well and isn't necessarily today. But that said, there's unity, but there's nothing, it's also the importance of diversity within the unity. Like one thing, Transgender Victoria was originally born because it was an effort, it was when the gay and lesbian rights lobby was being set up in Victoria. And there was an activist, Julie Peters, who really wanted it to be a gay, lesbian, and transgender rights lobby. And they eventually decided, like, no, you should have your own lobby, which at the time seemed like a divisive, not being united. But out of that, Transgender Victoria was born, and you very much had important coalition politics where there was well, the trans issues aren't the same, so it kind of does make sense for them to have a separate organization. And so there is an importance in sometimes having separate groups, I think, as you said, but unity is one word, maybe coalition's a better word, or another word. It's about coming together in coalitions to fight together in solidarity with each other, whilst acknowledging that they're not always the same issues.
Hi, no, I was just wanting to, just one clarification. You talked about, or my interpretation, the activism in the more recent times has been focused on what you said, middle class issues. Is that right? And if so, if that's the case, what are the then more acute or urgent issues if that becomes the area of focus or need that needs to be, targeted?
I think some of the stuff that Sam mentioned, like about prisons, I think that's really important. A lot of stuff around affirming and supporting sex workers and sex worker rights, which Victoria has decriminalized fully, finally. I think a lot more attention to the experiences of other trans and gender diverse people of color from other backgrounds. And I do think that, as Sam said before, that some of the organizations now are more attuned to this and are now being more active. But I guess the stuff that gets the big billing, I suppose, like gender affirming care for children, like 100% is an important issue and absolutely is one we should be talking about. But I also say, and I don't say this in a negative way, but just it is a matter of fact that if you look at the demographics of the children who are accessing, they are primarily middle class and they're primarily white. So what are we doing to try and support affirming care for people not from those backgrounds? So I guess that, I don't know, Sam, if you want to add to that.
No, I think that's good.
Well, to respond to that, it's because you've got to be privileged enough to have the education, the time, the money to get your access for your child to get support.
Yes.
A small proportion of Australian society has it.
Correct.
And on top of that, if you've added in things like neurodiversity, all those things, those parents who are doing that are the ones that are only really the ones that have got enough energy in the first place, that haven't been ground down by just trying to copy.
Oh, look, 100%, and maybe I came across wrong, I suppose. No, but I'm saying it's like, I guess it's that's the starting point, and often maybe the middle class issue is the starting point, but it's then we got to go further. Yeah. That's the thing, it's the going further, because you're absolutely, I don't disagree with that.
I'm not saying, I'm not criticizing it, it's just the fact that that's the reason why.
Absolutely.
And if it's hard for them, no wonder it's, even, you just got to have the strength in the first place, the intestinal fortitude. Yeah. That's hard.
There's no more questions coming from yourselves. Oh, there's one more there. Oh, two more. Okay. Right back.
How do you balance or juggling the historian versus activist sides of yourself? Because historians tend to be in that observer position, and yet these are issues that you're both very clearly passionate about as an activist. Then, how do you juggle that when you're writing?
Well, I guess, yeah, I'm not a trained historian, so I love history. I'm a enthusiast and lover of history, and I think that as I get older, the more I look to history to kind of understand the present. So, you know, I'm always trying to throw myself into, well, I'm actually trying to avoid all political issues at all times and end up getting drawn into them one way or another. That's probably more the way to explain it. And I find that taking the long view can be incredibly helpful mentally and emotionally to not get, you know, so overwhelmed and upset by what's going on that you're unable to function and unable to participate in campaigning or whatever. So, yeah, like the people that Noah interviewed in his book, you know, people that have already been mentioned, like Julie Peters, Brenda Appleton, Sally Goldner, you know, all those people that were involved, Kaylee White, who set up Transgender Victoria. I found them incredibly inspiring because they've been going for a really long time and they're still here and they've survived, and, you know, they get annoyed and burnt out and drop out of things for a while and have beefs with people and then they come back, you know, like just kind of seeing that social history in practice. And I guess what I've learned from, you know, my days of being a younger activist where I was prepared to sort of have a fight with somebody about something, I think that preserving the relationship has become really, really important to me. And you see, you know, I see people come around and I'm like, God, I knew you 20 years ago. And you know, oops, I was rude to you at a student meeting. I really shouldn't have been, because we really need to be united around this issue. So I think, yeah, a bit of humility and a bit of care for other people, like even if you vehemently disagree with them. I think that that's what I've learned from history, and that's what I've learned from those earlier activists, and just the patience. I don't have a lot of it. And yeah, Brenda Appleton, amazing, you know, just that inner calm, you know, I yearn for that inner calm. Yeah.
Well, I don't really consider myself an activist, to be honest. So the Daily Telegraph put a big picture of me, and I think it was 2017 when the grant got funded for the book, and they referred to me as an ABC commentator and transgender activist, as if it was like some pejorative. And I'm like, okay, well, I think that's actually an insult to activists to call me one, to be honest, because all these other people, they're out on the front lines doing this constantly. For me, though, it is about writing history to support activism, I suppose, in the sense that I think historical consciousness reminds people that the community has always been here, reminds that has always been fighting, reminds that there has been progress. I think that's a really important thing. I think Sam's made a really good point that it turns out it's more tenuous than we thought it was. But there has been progress, and if that can inspire real activists, who I don't consider myself one, then I think that's really important, and that's part of why it's something that I have done, and part of why I think history is really, really important.
I just wanted to say, and I don't want to be negative, and I'm certainly not criticising anybody, but I think we should all keep our eyes open and not breathe a sigh of relief that this review is being peopled with academics. Because from my own experience, from my research, looking at governments shopping around for an academic who will say what they want them to say, like the Howard government about working mothers, and from my background in neurodiversity advocacy, you also get academics who decide they're going to make their name and their career by telling the government what they want to hear. So I think don't breathe out and let's say, oh, it's okay, it's neutral, it's in the hands of the academics. Just
agreed.
Well, so it's a question for Noah. You mentioned the interviews that you made for your book. I was wondering, were they oral history interviews, and where have you found a repository for these oral histories?
Yep, they were oral history interviews, did about 104 of them or something like that. They ranged from one person who was in their 20s through to Rosemary Langton, who since passed away but was 89 years young when I interviewed her. She was the founder of Seahorse in New South Wales, which was Australia's first known trans organization. She's funny, Rosemary. Oh, they're all funny. Look, yeah, they're wonderful people, and almost all of them, bar one or two who didn't want them to be preserved, have been deposited in the Australian Queer Archives, which are the Australian Queer Archives, for those who don't know, I shout them out everywhere. Like, they're just amazing. They've been preserving LGBTIQA plus history since 1978. They're located at the Victorian Pride Centre in St Kilda, so we're actually very lucky that this Australian organisation is based here in Melbourne, all volunteer run, and if you ever need anything from them, you just get in touch, they'll let you come in. They have some stuff online, but not too much, but like Nick Henderson, who's one of the volunteers there, is kind of like a walking encyclopedia of their whole collection. If you say to Nick, like, oh, I'm doing research on blah, he'll be like, oh, you can look at this and this, and you're like, stop, you can only do what they have time. But yeah, Australian Queer Archives, I've put almost all of them there, and yep, hopefully people access them into the future.
Thank you. Can I just ask you one more question, Sam? What is a radio maker?
It's the liminal space between being on the radio and doing podcasts. So I do a weekly radio show on Triple R called Queer View Mirror, which we interview LGBTIQ people about politics and arts. So we interview heaps of historians and writers and whatnot. I've also produced some shows. So I did one called Crossing Time, A History of Transgender Australia for the ABC History Listen, which you can listen to. It's a 2-part series. We interviewed Noah. You can hear more of Noah. So yeah, I do. And others as well. And continue to make podcasts and stuff. So yes, that I was just trying to come up with a term that meant Transgender Warriors is still online. That was the first podcast radio show. It was on Joy, so you can listen to it on Joy, all the back episodes. There's some real pearls in there, like the interview with Kayleen White is my favourite interview because she's one of the founders of Transgender Victoria and is not really involved in activism anymore. She's a self-described shit farmer. She works in like sanitation, engineering and stuff, just a total legend. And, I just got to talk her ear off for half an hour and you can listen to that. And it's sort of all about her, really amazing experiences coming out as a trans woman in a completely different era, social context. So, yeah, check it out.
I'm sure, like me, you've found this discussion informative and engaging and I'd say heartfelt as well from both of you, Noah and Sam. Thank you so much for coming along and talking to us. We have a small gift for each of you as a token of our appreciation. Sam and Noah, just a little present. Please give these guys a round of applause. Thank you very much. There's still tea, coffee and biscuits and stuff down at the bottom if you want to stay a bit longer. If you haven't had any connection with us before and you'd like to hear more about the events that we have, both daytime, nighttime and the odd weekend, like book sales and things like that, please leave your name and email with Ellen at the bottom there on the desk and we'll be sure to get back in touch with you. And of course, if you want to be a member, it's very cheap. You can do that too. Thank you so much for coming along and hope to see you again next time.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt the clapping. If you want more trans history, the Trans Book Festival is happening this Saturday the 8th at the Wheeler Centre. Noah and I are going to do it all again. There's a whole day, so it goes from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. and it's an incredible lineup with some of the most exciting contemporary writers. And yes, Noah and I and Eve will be on a panel at 10:30. So yeah, check it out if you want to come. Please do.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.